What's up guys? Let's talk about defense, damage mitigation and how to build your champions tanky. Recently, when I was talking with Ash, he asked about his Duchess build and how he should change it. And this is something that people ask very often and there is pretty simple explanations, so let's talk about it. But basically in nutshell, I can already tell before going to the details, is that on your bottom pieces on artifacts, you want to get HP percentage main stat with the same as Genshin, and ideally defense percentage substat. You want to get that on every piece, you don't want to get defense main stat. It is the same with accessories as well. You want to get HP main stat on everything. That is ideally the tankiest way to build your champions. But there is some additional caveats to that which make it very different, especially for PvP. And let's talk about the details. Why exactly do you want to go with HP on everything? Here we have a chart that has been going around on Reddit for years. Many of you have probably seen this at some point. But this is basically the formula for defense in raid, how much damage it reduces at different levels. And there is also other forms of damage mitigation. Those are often actually more important in PvP than defense, and we're gonna talk about the reasons why is that. But in a nutshell, 4200 defense is considered the soft cap for defense in raid. At this point, you're gonna reduce the enemy damage by 80% and you only take 20% of the original damage. As you can see, if we go all the way to 6660 points, you're only gonna get 4 additional points of damage mitigation, even though we got almost 2500 more defense. And that is why you're always recommended to build 4200 defense for PvE, but in PvP it's actually very different, and defense is even worse than it is for PvE. Not that it is bad for PvE, it's very vital, but there is a lot of additional caveats and other things that are often more impactful. But what makes it so different for PvP than PvE is that we have ignore defense, and we have a lot of it actually. Most champions, even if they don't have any ignore defense on their skills at all, they're still gonna have Savage or Lethal and Cruel 2-piece set with Helm Smasher Mastery, and that's going to be at least 50% on every champion very often. And when you build your champions for PvP, you want to keep that in mind, that often they are gonna have somewhere between 50% and 100% of defense mitigation. And that is of course additive in this game, so let's say that you get 5% ignore defense from Cruel, and then you get 20% from some other effect like a skill. That's just gonna be 25 in total. Now you can't go past 100% ignore, but if you get to 100% defense ignore, that of course means that you completely ignore defense and it does nothing. And now we even got the Merciless set, and people are gonna get more defense than they did in the past. And ignore defense is so impactful, by the way. I have mentioned this many times, but I need to keep doing it because often people have never heard about it. But defense ignore is so powerful in PvP that Cruel 2-piece set is by far the best 2-piece set, even on HP scaling and defense scaling nukers. It is much better than crit damage. Now, if you have much better crit damage pieces, then on situations it can definitely be better, but if they have the same stats, then Cruel is definitely the best 2-piece set for every type of nuker. But assuming that the enemy isn't fully ignoring your defense, let's talk about some thresholds and give you a better visual impression about it. Now this is kind of old chart, a little bit outdated, but basically this is comparing at what threshold you want to focus more on HP than defense on your build. But just to make it clear, let's say that you have 60% defense ignore. That is the exact same thing in practice as if enemy had 60% decreased defense debuff. You're of course not gonna get into negative defense, and in the current meta, defense down debuff is not very popular. But for instance, this yellow line with 60% decreased defense debuff, this is basically something that you're mostly gonna see in practice when nukers are using Helm Smasher, Savage and Cruel. But basically we can already see from here that it is very different for PvP than PvE. Already at 3200 defense, not even 4200 defense, you're gonna want to aim for 150k HP, and like I said, often the enemy is completely gonna ignore your defense and it doesn't matter at all. So this changes the dynamic a lot, but one thing to keep in mind that even though I'm kind of doomsdaying here that defense doesn't matter and you can fully ignore it, when you don't proc Helm Smasher for instance, or if the enemy nuker doesn't have Savage set, defense does make a huge difference. You definitely still want to build it, but you don't want to focus on it or rely on it too much. But I would still recommend trying to have defense percentage substat on every piece and trying to aim for somewhere between 4 and 6k defense. But basically defense percentage main stats are kind of a no-go. Now if they have some additional effects, like let's say that you want to use refresh accessory or reaction accessory, then it definitely makes sense to go for those. And it's a lot smaller deal to use defense main stat accessories than bottom pieces on artifacts. And even on artifacts, let's say that you want to go for 6-piece stone skin or 4-piece bolster or something like that, it often might be practical to sacrifice some tankiness in paper for some other additional effects. And speaking of effects, even though defense mitigates the damage, it is by no means the only way to mitigate damage in raid. And something like strengthen buff for instance, decreased defense doesn't affect it. It always just flat out reduces the damage taken by 25%, and that is incredibly powerful when you pair it with other damage mitigating effects like defense or masteries and passives and so on. So instead of just focusing on defense, you want to focus on stacking all of the other possible additional effects. Like the damage mitigation that you get from masteries is actually very impactful, and it isn't a small deal at all. Now there is some other stuff, like you could use a guardian set for instance. It hasn't been very popular for a long time, but those things do mitigate the damage a lot, and it is completely possible that guardian sets could become meta again in PvP if we get some kind of new champions with interesting new types of skills. But in practice though, people are mostly going for stone skin, bolster and reaction nowadays in PvP. But like I said before, you go for those other damage mitigating effects along with defense, and you don't just rely on this. Now here is another chart that is kind of looking it from other perspective, and it will maybe help you realize why Rule 2P set is so powerful and why you want to use it even on HP and defense scaling champions. But here we basically compare the enemy defense on your ignore defense and how much damage you gain from ignore defense with otherwise the same type of build. And as you can see, around the 4000 defense points, you almost double your damage if you have Savage, Cruel plus Helm Smasher. And this is why some champions with inbuilt ignore defense hit insanely hard normally, but when there is a Harima in enemy team, they don't do any damage at all because they don't have that high multipliers and they rely on the ignore defense to do this incredible damage. The difference between let's say 80% and 100% defense ignore is massive. Even if you have just a little bit of defense after the enemy defense ignore, it still makes a huge difference. But if your defense is completely getting ignored and you're taking true damage, it is going to be very significant and much more than normally you're used to. That's why something like George can do those bonkers hits that no other champion in the game can basically do. You might have heard the term EHP sometimes, and it stands for effective health points. Here I have a calculator that can basically compare your defense and HP and show you which build is best in practice. And I kind of gave you 3 different examples. The first example is my actual Duchess build with 157k HP and 4.7k defense, which gives us a total EHP of 836k, and it is the best out of these 3 builds. And then we have another build with 180k HP and 3.5k defense, and as you can see, it's a little bit worse, like is the third build with 120,000 HP and 8,000 defense. But in practice, when the enemy completely ignores your defense, or almost fully ignores your defense, the second build is still going to be the best out of these 3 for PvP. And that's basically the point of this video in a nutshell. Health points is the king, defense is good sometimes, but it's only one of the means that you want to have to mitigate damage. It's not the one you focus on. You will have health points, then you have some defense that sometimes can be fully ignored, and then you stack that with buffs like strengthen and masteries and passives and so on. And that's how you actually build a champion tanky. Additional point to ignore defense and damage mitigation, let's think about it from the other perspective. How do you make the best possible damage builds? Well, Hellhades calculator can do it for you, just like the Excel file I was using now that was giving us the exact numbers and calculating the EHP. Hellhades optimizer can calculate the perfect damage build for you, but you need to know what you're looking for, and let me quickly show you how to make the best possible Protoss build. So first of all, you go for damage mode, which automatically calculates the best damage for you, but you need to set some certain thresholds to make it do it the proper way. And first of all, you choose the skill that you want to calculate this with. If you are using a champion like Protoss that has ignore defense with their skills, and it is their main damage and skill that they rely on, then you want to calculate the damage around this skill, which will sometimes affect the builds. But not only do you want to do that, but you actually want to take into account the enemy defense, and this is the most important part. Now, the Hellhades optimizer automatically sets the enemy defense level at 2000, and this is obviously for PvE reasons, because the bosses in campaigns and dungeons and so on generally have very low defense unless we're talking about Hydra. So let's set the enemy defense here at 4700, which will be something that you will see on my Duchess for instance. And then you also want to take into account that are you generally relying on attack buff or not. But if it's going to be some kind of speed team for instance, you want to take the attack buff into account, so you want to check that here as well. Then all there is really left to do is that you need to decide the minimum speed that you want on champion. Otherwise, it's probably gonna give you an incredibly slow build that is going to be the highest damage that you can theoretically do, but speed is super important, so you want to set a minimum speed. And then all that there is left, you could choose some specific sets, but when we already set the enemy defense level and we're calculating for the highest damage, it's already taking this into account, and it's definitely going to use lethal and cruel sets. Normally, if you don't set the enemy defense level on optimizer, that's why you might get builds without lethal and cruel, or maybe only one of them. But when you set the defense level at high enough, then you're definitely going to get lethal or cruel or savage, even without actually looking up the set from here. Though it will actually calculate a bit faster if you choose the specific sets. And when I do this myself, I'm just gonna set lethal and cruel because I know I have enough gear on them to get the best sets. But if you're unsure, just leave the sets unchosen and it will find out. I'm also gonna set out all of the glyph levels to max. Now you could also choose the option just to not include the glyphs, but then you're not gonna differentiate between 5-star and 6-star items properly. And sometimes it might give you, let's say, a 5-star shield, even though you can do a better build with 6-star one. So I'm just gonna set everything here to max, and then we're gonna get proper build, and that's it. Now we will see what Rotos build I get. Is it gonna be different than my current build? Because I have actually gotten some pieces of gear lately, so it might have changed. So it finished calculating, and actually I do have upgrade on my Rotos. I wasn't really expecting it, even though I said it, but yeah, I didn't have this before. I had this weapon for a very long time. I was planning to use it on Rotos when I happened to get him +4, which would have given me more critical rate, but apparently with this new shield we're gonna be able to do it as well. I'm gonna get some extra attack and crit damage, and I'm gonna lose a little bit of HP, but it's gonna be more damage in total. And crit damage is super good for Rotos, because you're gonna steal HP during the fight anyway. You get a lot more benefit out of it. It scales both HP and attack, but you also get the large amount of additional HP during the fight, so it actually makes a huge difference. That's it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. Like, subscribe, and see ya.